Our first item of business is a motion of condolence in the name of John Swinney for Jean Freeman. We are honoured to welcome Jean's partner Susan and members of Jean's close family and friends to our gallery today. I was privileged to work with Jean out with and in Holyrood. In my previous spokesperson roles on health and on social security last session, I worked with Jean on a number of occasions in both of her Cabinet Secretary positions. Jean was always professional, kind and determined. Her commitment to public service was clear. It was a tremendous shock and sadness to learn of her death, and on behalf of all at the Scottish Parliament, our deepest condolences to Susan and all of Jean's family, friends and colleagues. She will be very sadly missed. First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Jean Freeman was a remarkable colleague, a woman of principle and a woman of courage. She was dedicated in all that she did, selfless in her actions and unfailingly compassionate. Scottish politics and public life in Scotland have lost an outstanding individual who leaves for us all an incredible legacy. Working alongside her, both here in this chamber and in Cabinet, I valued her counsel, her wisdom, her solidarity and her care. Jean gave her counsel freely and openly to support the common good. She always offered wise thinking when we wrestled with difficult questions. Whenever I faced political challenges, Jean would offer support. And at moments of personal difficulty, Jean would offer care and kindness. For those outside of government, Jean will always be remembered, first and foremost, for the pivotal role she played during the COVID pandemic. That was one of the greatest public health crises in history, one of the greatest challenges our National Health Service has ever seen, one of the greatest challenges our society has seen. There was no blueprint or precedent for us to draw upon during that period. All of us, politicians, citizens, community leaders, were in uncharted waters. And Jean, as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, was one of the people who provided selfless leadership to help us steer our way through it. Thankfully, Jean was the right person for the job. I remember well her leadership, her pragmatism and her determined commitment to evidence-based and necessarily often brave decision-making. Every single day, with exceptional dedication, grace and selflessness, she threw herself into her work to keep people healthy and safe without a thought to her own health, to support our health services in which she took such pride and gave such commitment. She was the first to accept that she may not have got everything right, but Jean made a terrific difference to and for us all. And while she will always be remembered for what she did then, it is only one highlight in a long and distinguished career built on social justice, care and service to others. Jean said that Jean will always be remembered for the moral values that she brought to all that she did. And she said that she learned those moral values from her parents. Her mother worked 12-hour shifts as a sister in a psychiatric hospital. Her father was a trade unionist and served in the RAF during World War II. He spoke to Jean of the social contract between a government and its people, and of the inequality he saw in coming home after the war ended. He taught her the need for fairness and compassion, that everyone in our society deserves equal opportunity. Jean took those lessons to heart. They were values she practised in her politics, in her career and in her life. When she became the first woman to chair the National Union of Students in Scotland, when she trained and worked as a nurse, when she founded Apex Scotland, when she was a member of the Parole Board for Scotland and a member of the Scottish Police Services Authority and the National Waiting Time Centre. Jean was living the lessons she learned from her parents, a commitment to social justice and to improving people's lives. In 1996, Jean received an OBE for her service to the rehabilitation of people with experience of the criminal justice system. Jean also worked as a senior civil servant and then special advisor for the then First Minister Jack McConnell, where she was heavily involved in the purchase of the Golden Jubilee Hospital in Clydebank. She could see the benefits of ensuring that that significant asset in Scotland could be better used for the benefit of all in Scotland. Jean's political journey demonstrated a willingness to think afresh about the world around her. She was a founding member of Women for Independence, one of the faces of the Yes for Scotland campaign, a calm voice of authority to persuade others of the benefits of independence. In the 2016 election, Jean was elected as MSP for Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley and became a tireless advocate for her constituency. It was her work, perhaps as the first ever Minister for Social Security in Scotland, that was arguably another of her landmark achievements in life. In that role, she managed the devolution of new powers and the creation of Social Security Scotland. Our social security system is built on dignity, on fairness and on respect. And that is because of Jean. Those were her values, values she embodied and put into her politics, values passed down from her parents, values put into the law of Scotland. I was fortunate enough to see those values practised up close. She contributed so much to government and to this Parliament, and so much to the lives of people across Scotland. For Jean, this was her life's mission, one she carried from her childhood, throughout her life, and up to the very end, even volunteering, supporting members of the public at the Beatson Cancer Centre with the assistance of the tea trolley. Her death was a terrible shock, coming just weeks after her cancer diagnosis. On behalf of the Scottish Government and the people of Scotland, I want to express my deepest condolences to her partner Susan and her much-loved family who are joining us in the gallery today. I always welcomed Jean's wisdom, her considered opinions, her advice and her kindness. And I, like so many others across this chamber and across this country, want to express my gratitude for all that Jean did over the course of her life, for her service, for her dedication, for her compassion and for her humanity, for the example that Jean set for us and the legacy that she leaves behind. I pay tribute to Jean Freeman, a woman of principle who lived out her values, shared them with us all and made Scotland a better country as a result.
Thank you, First Minister. I now call on Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I immediately associate myself with and commend the remarks of the First Minister and say, on behalf of myself and on the Conservative Party, I send our deepest condolences to Susan and all of Jean's family, friend, colleagues and wider party. And say how touched I am that Susan asked if I might say a few words about Jean this afternoon. And I apologise if, in part, these repeat some of the remarks I made in the chamber shortly after we heard of her passing, because it felt to me to welcome Jean into government at the point when she first became a minister, a happy duty at the time. And I look back at what I said then and noticed that the tribute of Jean's mother to her was that her daughter had a voice that could sell coal. And coal was not what she then went on to sell, but she spoke always with tremendous authority and vigour. And that was, I think, something that was deeply impressive. She brought to the job considerable otherworld experience, and I think Parliament recognised and appreciated that. People will know I used to do these welcomes to ministers at the time, and I used to quite relish the prospect, I have to say. But I used to also enjoy good parliamentary performance. And I used to love the way Jean would sit very still, very quiet. She didn't allow herself to be noised up. And there would be these probably from me, these very theatrical performances from elsewhere in the chamber, and they would think they were lambasting her. And she would stand up very quietly at the end, and she would always begin by saying, "So." And then she would eviscerate every argument that had just been made by the other person. And I quite often looked across and just exchanged a twinkle in the eye, because I knew what she'd done, and she did it with tremendous effect. Why? Because she was supremely well briefed and very committed to the job she did. Never more so, in my experience, than the way in which she engaged directly with the women who were affected by transvaginal mesh. Because it was Jean's bill, which Humza Yousaf was to take into legislation at the start of this session, that provided for the transport of women to the United States, to Dr. Veronica's, to have the mesh that they'd been told in many cases had already been removed from within them, removed by him in Missouri. And that was an opportunity not extended to women anywhere else in the United Kingdom. It was a bill that Jean embraced and took forward. And for those women, I remember one constituent, Lorna Farrell, who went to where Rocky, Sylvester Stallone, had gone up the steps in the Rocky movie. She got out her wheelchair, free of mesh, and staggered up those steps and stood at the top, thanks to Jean. Jean made a difference, and there are women all over Scotland and their families who will be forever grateful for what she did. But let me finish with this final reflection. Decades ago, I sat at a private dinner during the height of the Falklands War for the then Prime Minister, and I was sitting next to Alec Douglas-Hume, and I asked him, what's it like to lead in a crisis? He said, well, the first thing is the duty of others to offer support, constructive support, which is something I tried to remember and do when the COVID pandemic fell. But he also said something I never forgot. Other politicians may wish they occupied the desk. Other politicians might think it would all have been better if they'd been in charge. Other politicians might lambast and say that was ridiculous. But for the Prime Minister, the First Minister, and the women in the hot seat, they're making life and death decisions. And some of them represent a burden they carry with them for the rest of their lives. They don't walk away from it. It's something they feel because they had to take decisions, very brave decisions, that had fundamental consequences. That's a real sense of duty. So I say to Susan, Jean made a difference. She had a sense of duty. And this Parliament and everybody in it should be grateful for the work, the job and the legacy that she leaves behind.
Thank you, Mr Carlaw. I now call on Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by echoing and enthusiastically supporting the comments of both the First Minister John Swinney and of Jackson Carlaw. I was actually thinking when listening to both John Swinney and Jackson Carlaw's contributions that actually the thought of Jean actually does put a smile on many of our faces, and I think that's a remarkable way to remember anybody. Jean Freeman was a tremendous public servant, someone who dedicated her life to improving other people's lives across our great country. And so I want to put on record the condolences and best wishes of everyone in the Scottish Labour Party. And in particular, I would like to send our love and best wishes to Jean's partner, Susan, who she was so absolutely in love and devoted to. And to all her friends and family, love and condolences, because she was someone that was respected not just on the SNP benches, but actually right across the political spectrum and by so many people out of politics too. Jean was a formidable public figure. She dedicated her life to public service and to social justice for our great country. And she started her career as a student leader and went on to become Health Secretary during a global pandemic. She worked as a civil servant, a government advisor serving a former Labour First Minister, Jack McConnell, and of course a member of the Cabinet. And in every single role she did, she brought the same work ethic, the same strong opinions, and the same tireless determination to make our country better. She was a formidable human being and public figure, ferociously clever, fired by a strong sense of justice and an enduring commitment to public service. Scottish politics and public life will be poorer without her. Presiding Officer, I've already said this in this chamber twice already, but I want to repeat it again now. I personally will always be thankful to Jean Freeman for the steps she took to get us closer to the truth in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital scandal. And I know that goes for me, it goes for the whistleblowers, it goes for the families, who all appreciate the significant progress that was made in their fight for justice, because Jean Freeman was someone that was willing to listen, was willing to learn, and she was willing to act. And she was willing to challenge institutions, and she was willing to question her own. So she will be especially missed, of course, by her colleagues in the SNP, and my thoughts are with each and every single one of them. But she will be sorely missed by people across these benches and across the political spectrum. And so to Susan and to Jean's family and friends, Jean was loved, Jean was respected, Jean made a difference, and Jean delivered. You should all be so proud of the life she lived and the legacy she leaves. And I hope you take heart from the fact that we all mourn with you.
Thank you, Mr Sarwar. I now call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by associating myself with what Anas Sarwar opened with, that just remembering Jean brings a smile to your face, tempered somewhat by Jackson Carlaw's observation. Having been at the receiving end of some of those eviscerations in the chamber, it was a usefully humbling experience, certainly for a first-time member. I first met Jean Freeman at a cocktail bar, Blue Dog on West George Street in Glasgow, where I was with Susan, Charlene Somerville and other former colleagues. It was an orange juice for me. Jean and Susan were having something much more sophisticated than that. But I wanted to open here because knowing Jean at first through Susan was to know the incredible love that they had for each other, and that was a privilege to behold. As Mike Russell noted in Jean's obituary, she started her party political journey in the Young Communists, and that was a proud tradition, one that many of the leading feminists of recent decades started in. And I'm mentioning that because I think Jean Freeman will probably be the last holder of high office in this country to have started out part of that particular political movement. And that means the end of quite a significant chapter in the political history of this country. For the independence movement, which is how I got to know her, she was an incredible advocate of our cause, someone who was serious, accomplished, a former senior figure in a Labour administration. I had the privilege of speaking alongside her at a number of public meetings, including in places like Bearsden, that were not exactly a hotbed of support for our cause, but where people were absolutely willing to listen to Jean. She exuded authority. She had an extensive knowledge. But I don't think that was why people were so willing to listen. It was because she was so obviously and so deeply passionate, not just a policy wonk, but someone who was driven by a vision for this country, a vision of a fairer and a more just Scotland. And that was a vision that she brought here to Parliament. As the First Minister said, I think it's most obvious in the social security system that we now have, a system that Jean designed that was intended to give people dignity, to lift them up rather than punish them for the circumstances they found themselves in. She built that system by listening to and by trusting the people who most needed its support. Because Jean always saw politics as being about people. She had a clear vision. She was of a deep ideological conviction, but that didn't mean getting lost in political abstracts. And she certainly didn't see this as a place for pontificating. This was a place to get stuff done for the people that we represent. And she was unquestionably one of the most able and talented people ever elected to this Parliament. So my thoughts and prayers and love are with Susan and Jean's whole family. I hope that they can take some comfort today in seeing how widely respected and how widely loved she was and still is across this chamber.
Thank you, Mr Greer. I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, occasions like this remind us of the common humanity that we all share and the fundamental values which drive us in public service. But there have been too many motions like this in the course of this Parliament, too many towering and substantial giants of our politics and our Parliament taken from us far too soon. And Jean's passing in particular is a terrible blow. I didn't find it hard to reach for the words of this tribute, Presiding Officer. They came freely, because the news of her passing left me and my party with a profound sense of sadness. While she was certainly our opponent and adversary, she always conducted herself with grace and with purpose. She was a class act. You knew to trust her at her word and never doubted the depth of the intellect which underpinned all of the decisions which she was ever party to. We crossed swords, of course we did, but while she was never shirked from joining battle, she never lost that state of grace or of decency with which she always conducted herself. I remember one time on social media, she refused to be drawn onto the field of battle when I had a viral photograph of a cremated omelette that had been served to a patient in an Edinburgh hospital. But she had it dealt with. She had it dealt with quietly and with purpose. That was a simpler time. Before any of us had heard of Wuhan, China or COVID-19, I cannot remember a time in my life when I was more frightened than in those early days of the pandemic. We knew the virus was coming. We knew that lockdown was coming. We didn't know what any of it would mean for our nation or our people. And yet Jean was the first to strip away the artifice of political division and invite me and other health spokespeople into the very heart of government decision-making and thinking in our response to the coronavirus emergency. The weight of responsibility and ferocious pace of decision-making on her must have been immense. But she always found time to respond to every text message I sent her, every question, every suggestion, and sometimes on a daily basis. And when my daughter fell sick in the first pandemic, she would ask me for updates every day. That was the measure of her humanity and her decency as a person. She worked tirelessly and with singular sense of purpose throughout the darkest days of that national emergency. And she carried us with her and never showed any sign of the terror that gripped so many of us in those early days. On news of her passing, I reached for the last exchanges we shared over text message. And, Presiding Officer, it speaks, I think, to the affection and respect that I had for her personally, that one of the last messages I sent on her decision to step down from Parliament reads as follows. Genuinely sorry to learn of your news re-stepping down. You've always been one of the brightest, nicest and best. Her reply I will keep personal to me, but it was steeped in the warmth and grace which defined her, and I will treasure it. On behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, can I wish Susan and her family and all of her friends love, light, laughter and the promise of better days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Cole-Hamilton. I now call Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I associate myself with all the remarks that have been made so far? I only got to know Jean when I arrived in Parliament in 2016. And a year later, I ended up, like yourself, Presiding Officer, on the Social Security Committee as we took the bill through. I got to know her very well over that year and a half period. Often she would phone me up and help me in regard to drafting my amendments. But what was striking every time was that if she said she would do something, it happened. You could trust her word absolutely, completely. And as well as that, she also had the very personal touch. I remember on a Friday morning walking through Ashley Ainsley Hospital on our way to a meeting. There was something going on in our family that obviously she had heard of, and she phoned, not talk about Social Security, but just to ask how I was. I think that's a mark of a person and the individual we remember this morning, or this afternoon. The other thing that struck me most was that the way she could work with other politicians from other parliaments. There was a number of negotiations going on at that time with the UK government. And I think it would be fair to say that the Minister in London's politics was probably as far away as you could get in regard to Jean's. But having the privilege of sitting in on a couple of those meetings and watching her not score a cheap political point, but actually what was best for the people of Scotland, was a lesson that I learned, and a lesson I think all of us need to learn when we do our politics. Yes, we can make cheap political points, but what effect does it have on the people of Scotland? And that is what she did when devising and taking through the bill on Social Security Scotland. It will be one of the things that will be there going forward, that she drove and designed, but perhaps most importantly worked with the disabled community and with across the chamber politicians to get the best. So can I also pass on my respect and thanks to her, to say how sorry we are to Susan and the family for their loss, and to say we have lost somebody here in Scotland who really did make a difference to individual lives, and that is surely a legacy that is worth having. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. I call on George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'd like to open with the opportunity to talk about Susan Stewart. I'd like to thank Susan for asking you to ask me to be able to, being a former Minister of Parliamentary Business, I know that's the protocol, to actually ask me to speak here today. And it means a lot to me because Jean meant an absolute lot to me as well. One of the things I keep trying to remember, and we all must remember, is that Susan, no matter how we all feel, it's Susan that is going to be feeling this loss more than any of us. And I think my heart goes out to Susan at this stage because I know the loss she'll be feeling. But Jean Freeman was a force of nature, an impassioned campaigner, a feisty woman who didn't suffer fools. And so, of course, Presiding Officer, I was drawn to her. Have you met the women in my life? When Jean liked you, she liked you. She was hugely loyal. If for whatever reason you found yourself on the wrong side of Jean, then the best thing to do was run. Run for your life. I was lucky. I loved Jean and she loved me. We weren't hugging each other all the time and telling each other. It was a very West Coast of Scotland working class love. But we had our moments, usually with me being the one that had the emotional outburst. But that will come as no surprise to anyone in this chamber. Jean had a brick in her office. I often wondered why someone would have a brick in their office. It was a brick of her school, of where she came from, because she had a sense of who she was and where she came from, and that brick represented where she came from in her life. And that just meant everything to me, because some of you know how the pride I feel for my hometown of Paisley. So that was, I could understand Jean right away. She would call me out if she thought I was wrong and tell me exactly what I'd done wrong. Even as recently as last year, she was texting me, telling me about how stupid I was to do a certain thing. Now, Presiding Officer, I'm not telling anyone today what that certain thing is. You'll need to work out for yourself. But she used that time, even during her retirement, to tell me. I also remember a conversation we had recently where she questioned the logic of our First Minister no longer having me in the Scottish Government. But as I say, Jean was a very good mate. Sometimes, at the most inappropriate times, I would try and make her laugh, because when Jean laughed, her whole face would light up, her eyes would sparkle, along with her very throaty laugh. When Jean was Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport during COVID, the rest of the world saw the women we knew. I had constituents tell me how much Jean and Nicola meant to them during that very, very scary time in their life. That period now seems like a bad dream, much of which we're still dealing with, but people saw what Jean Freeman was all about. Many of you will be aware that Susan Stewart, her partner, is football daft, and again, perfect for me. She's a St Mirren fan. She's a member of the Tartan Army, so Susan and I have a lot in common. Jean, not so much. Even during her tenure as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Jean never really got our beautiful game, our national pastime. To Jean, she never understood what all the excitement was about. Now, Susan and I are firmly in the Bill Shankly quote of people saying football's a matter of life and death. I say to them it's a lot more important than that. But during her time away from politics, she started following the great game, mainly with Susan, for Susan. Both her and Susan attended the Euro 2024 in Germany, along with half the country. They followed St Mirren's recent success in the League Cup this season. They did both attend the final and semi-final games. Jean did this for Susan, because that's what Jean was all about, looking out for other people and making everyone else feel good. When I heard of Jean's illness, I was devastated, but Jean, being Jean, managed to do it a very Jean Freeman way. So much so, she nearly convinced me she wasn't as ill as everybody else had told me, and there was a way she could work out of it. But that was Jean, being Jean again, and thinking about how I felt. The night before she died, I was in the house shouting at the TV as St Mirren had a terrible result against Airdrie. We won the game, but it was a terrible game. And that was the most important thing in my life at that moment, was that football game. I got a message from Susan saying that Jean had worsened and she was permanently at Jean's side. She told me that Jean came round just as the final whistle had blown and said, "George will be pleased that Mirren won." Susan then sent a picture of Jean, demanded that she send a picture of her in her hospital bed clapping St Mirren getting through to the next round of the Cup. That's a classy lady, Presiding Officer. That woman, even when she was dying, was thinking about someone else. She's thinking about her big daft pal for Paisley. But Jean Freeman was an extraordinary woman who touched the lives of everyone fortunate enough to know her. She was fierce, loyal, compassionate, utterly devoted to those she loved. From her powerful advocacy during the independence referendum to her leadership through the darkest days of COVID, Jean showed Scotland what true public service looks like. She was a force of nature who never forgot where she came from, who fought tirelessly for what she believed in, and who made everyone around her better just by being there. Even in her final hours, Jean was thinking of others, making sure Susan knew that she loved her, making sure her big daft pal from Paisley was happy. That was Jean Freeman. That will always be Jean Freeman. And whilst our hearts are broken, we're all better people for having known her. Susan, we cannot begin to understand your loss, but I promise you this. Jean's legacy, her spirit, her fierce love and loyalty will live in every single one of us. She was, and always will be, simply incredible.
Thank you, Mr Adam, and I call on Nicola Sturgeon.
Not for the first time, Presiding Officer, but perhaps for different reasons, George Adam has made me cry. Trying to sum up the strong, smart, funny, incredibly kind woman who was Jean Freeman in just a few minutes is an almost impossible task. But I know how much the words already spoken today across the chamber will have meant to Susan, to Jean's nieces, Nicola and Louise, and to her great nieces, Emily and Georgie, who all join us here today. Long before I had the privilege, and I use that word deliberately, of calling Jean a friend, I knew her by reputation, by her fearsome reputation. I was leader of the opposition in here, and she was a special advisor to the then First Minister Jack McConnell. I vividly remember her scowling at me once in the garden lobby after I'd given her boss a particularly rough FMQs. I'm sure I scowled back, but inside I was absolutely terrified. A bit later, I got to know Jean as the beloved other half of my longtime friend, Susan. And it was through their relationship that Jean and I became such close friends. Of course, it was in the run-up to the independence referendum that I first campaigned with Jean and discovered then just how powerful it was to have Jean Freeman on your side. Her co-founding of Women for Independence spoke not just to her lifelong feminism, but also to her conviction that was so obvious too in her ministerial roles that voices traditionally sidelined in politics must be heard much more loudly. After her election as an MSP in 2016, Jean became one of the most important members of my government, steering Social Security Scotland into existence and making sure it was founded on the right values, and then, of course, overseeing the National Health Service. As George has alluded to, however, it is fair to say that Susan has never allowed me to forget the idiocy, which I think is the word she used, of me including sport in Jean's portfolio. During the 5 years that we served together in government, I learned from direct personal experience that Jean Freeman possessed one of the sharpest, most astute political brains that I have ever known. As we've already heard, she plied her political trade in the Communist Party before joining Labour, and then, of course, the SNP. But Jean was no machine politician. She had an almost perfect blend of intellectual and emotional intelligence, and she had an instinctive understanding that political ideology means nothing if it doesn't improve people's lives. When thinking about how best to encapsulate the Jean Freeman I knew and loved, 3 hallmarks of her character stand out. First, principle. Jean's starting point on every issue was principle, not expediency or political advantage, but principle. Now, that didn't mean she wasn't pragmatic or that she wouldn't compromise. She was, and she did. But it was always from a foundation of principle, a clear-headed view of what, in her estimation, was right and wrong, What would best further the principles of fairness, dignity, inclusion and advance the cause of social justice that was always her primary motivation. Second, public service. Throughout her career, in all of the different roles she held, Jean was driven by a deep sense of public service. You know, most people won't realise this, but in the last couple of years of her life, Jean spent a very considerable amount of time preparing for and giving evidence to two public inquiries, the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry and, of course, the COVID Inquiry. Now, given the extent to which this work was eating into her retirement, she could have been forgiven for grumbling about it, but she never did, because Jean understood and Jean believed that for a senior government minister, the duty of service owed to the public does not end when you demit office. Thirdly, and for me personally, the most important hallmark of all was friendship. The most common thing said to me today by members of the public is that our daily presence on their TV screens during COVID helped them through that dreadful time. But the truth is, I couldn't have done what I did during COVID without Jean by my side. As Health Secretary, she had a massive responsibility of her own to carry, but she also helped me bear mine, particularly in those dark days of March and April 2020. There would be times just before stepping onto the podium when I would feel overwhelmed by the grimness of the update I was about to give. And in these moments, Jean would often just lightly touch my arm and say something simple like, "You can do this." That got me through. For all Jean's friends, the suddenness and severity of her diagnosis came as a profound and brutal shock. But in the days that followed, there was also solace. We got to say to her the things we wanted her to know about her impact on our lives. We got to tell her that we loved her. Visiting Jean in a hospital over these 3 short weeks also brought an incredible privilege. It allowed us to bear witness to the depth of the love, the unconditional love that existed between her and Susan. Susan, who truly was the light and love of her life. Susan, love like yours and Jean's is all too rare, and it doesn't die. It will be with you always. Just as the memory and the legacy of Jean Freeman, a woman I am so lucky to have had in my life, will be with all of us forever. Rest in peace, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you. The question is that motion 20721 in the name of John Swinney on a motion of condolence be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed, and there will now be a short pause before we move on to business this afternoon.